It brought the platoon closer together, and it forced you to deal with things personally, about your own mortality.
The IED that killed Sergeant Ettinger is just one of the insurgents' deadly weapons. Another is Vehicle-Borne Improvised Explosive Devices, or VBIEDs, cars or trucks packed with explosives.
They're extremely dangerous because they'll have like 10 artillery shells in the back seat of the car, and they're all going to go up at one time. It's a fireball that goes up about 3 stories high.
Most dangerous of all are suicide bombers driving vehicles packed with explosives.
Worse could have happened, I think, if we'd have gone back out there.
Back on the ground at Lake Tartar, the insurgents are fleeing in motorboats along the canal system. Now, Lieutenant Rowald and Sergeant Kemmer can search the camp.
The enemy camp consisted of 3 tents and 3 vehicles. Inside the tents were various living, sleeping, eating areas, along with one that seemed to be their center of operations. We ended up pulling suitcases full of information, documents, pictures, and some plans out of one of the tents.
Those RPGs are going to pay off dividends.
The information gathered at this camp was sent up the chain of command and definitely had a positive impact at the operational level.
We expected to find some people when we went up to exploit the camps and stuff, but we didn't. You know, we looked for blood trails and anything leading back to the canal or, you know, to where the boats were along the lake. And nothing, just footprints.
In the heat of battling al-Qaeda terrorists at Lake Tartar, Kiowa helicopter pilot James Williamson believes his gunner is wounded. Seeking medical attention, he lands his copter close to the Humvees Sabre 2 and Sabre 3, less than 200 yards from the enemy forces.
I just commanded an aggressive landing to the back of the formation and unbuckled, jumped out, run around. Saw the big hole in the panel, so I thought this is not going to be good, but he was at least coherent and he was looking around. So I opened his armor side panel and just did a quick sweep of him.
He got out of the aircraft, ran around real quick to pat me down to feel for blood. I'm like, what are you doing? I'm freaking out.
You okay? You okay?
Back in the aircraft, because you could hear and see the spots of dirt kicking up from them shooting back at us.
He appeared to be okay. So quickly run back around the other side of the aircraft. Could still hear gunfire over down the engagement area. Climb back in and come straight out.
I think that's the only time in Iraq where I had really feared for my own life.
The 2 Kiowa helicopters racing back across the desert to their airbase are almost out of fuel and defenseless. Aboard Dark Horse 11, pilot Jim Cornell and gunner Chuck Folk smell something burning.
We don't know if we're on fire. They said they couldn't see any gas leaking. That doesn't necessarily mean we're not leaking gas. So let's get out of this airplane as quick as we can.
Willie's the bullet magnet. If you want to get shot at, you fly with Willie, because he'll find it. He does what he needs to do to find the bad guy, and that guy, I'll tell you what, he's a cat. He's got 9 lives.
Meanwhile, Dark Horse 11, the other Kiowa, has lost in-flight communications due to an AK round to its control panel. Both choppers are low on ammo and fuel. They must leave the combat zone.
We didn't want to leave. We didn't have a choice at this point. I had maybe 100 rounds left. We try not to go completely out, because if something pops up in our face en route to refuel or something like that, we wouldn't have any way to deal with it.
The men of 2nd Battalion try to advance 3 different times, but each time the deadly fire from the bunkers is simply too much. Just when it seems that it can't get worse, Specialist Ray Zaccone hears a sound that sends chills up his spine. In response to a radio call from Villalobos, 2 Bradley fighting vehicles are sent to the area to help in the rescue. August 2nd, 1969. It's 10 o'clock at night on the upper Saigon River, South Vietnam. 6 river patrol boats, called PBRs, move through murky water.
That is the darkest place I've ever seen. In some places you can't see your hand in front of your face like this, and it gets really scary at times.
Oh man.
The mortar fire drives the North Koreans from Hill 296. The Marines have become kings of the hill. But a devastating counterattack begins.
After we got up there, they immediately started shelling us with the mortars, so we knew they had the hill zeroed in. As we had lots of guys wounded, killed on that peak with the mortars. Then they would bonsai the hills, you know, up the hills after us. But we had lots of casualties on that hill.
It was very difficult for our corpsmen to even get to
The mortar fire drives the North Koreans from Hill 296. The Marines have become kings of the hill. But a devastating counterattack begins.
After we got up there, they immediately started shelling us with the mortars, so we knew they had the hill zeroed in. As we had lots of guys wounded, killed on that peak with the mortars. Then they would bonsai the hills, you know, up the hills after us. But we had lots of casualties on that hill.
Military Channel. Go behind the lines.
It was one of the most crucial battles of the war in Vietnam.
We didn't really know what we were getting into.
We come under intense fire.
It was like we'd arrived at the fort out in the west, and the Indians are all around it.
For 8 days, U.S. Marines fight to take back the South Vietnamese city of Hue.
The adrenaline is pumping so hard that there's no time for fear.
So you learn to depend upon each other.
Those who were there will never forget the Battle of Hue. At the end of the first day of the Battle of Hue, the Marines remain surrounded.
We knew we would need some reinforcements. If we're going to continue with the jobs that we had there, that was going to have to happen.
But no one knows when that will happen. Until help arrives, the Marines at Mac V are on their own, and the rest of Hue is now completely under communist control. Steer and Kelly run for their lives. Now, the advancing NVA threaten to swarm over Mike Kiley's men, who've been hacking out the landing zone. Kiley frantically radios for help.
Kiley calls me and says, bring as many men as you can bring down here to help us. We're about to be overrun. So I took approximately half of the men I could get my hands on in my platoon and just headed down toward the LZ that they were working on.
Tom Remington and his men rush down the hill and try to come to Kiley's rescue. But they run head-on into the NVA, who are now pouring up the hill.
Looked like you were shooting right through them. Nothing was stopping them. They kept coming. They kept coming.
I know I had a bad shrapnel wound in my leg. And then a few seconds later, I was shot in the shoulder. But all of a sudden, 8, 9, 10 men with me. I think maybe 5 are dead and all the other 5 are wounded.